It's my pleasure and honor to be here with Yavilah McCoy, who is an educator, activist, and spiritual teacher. She's also the CEO of the International Diversity Consulting Group Visions, located in Boston. Thanks for making time.
Thank you, Shmuly, for having me here.
So my first question for you is, how is the Jewish community doing with racial justice issues within the Jewish community itself?
Well, what I would say about the Jewish community itself is that we really need to pay closer attention to our relationship to whiteness. Because one of the things that being a Jew of color causes to come higher in terms of people's consciousness is that there is such a thing as a white Jew. And often people don't take seriously that experience itself brings with it privilege, access, resources that complicate our relationship to racial justice. And in order to have a conversation that's dimensional and that brings you into relationship with some integrity and accountability, we have to both talk about being Jews of color and talk about being white Jews and figure out what the relationship is between those things internal to the Jewish community.
And to what extent is that happening right now?
So it's happening some. A number of leaders now are in public spaces as Jewish leaders. So you have April Baskin and you have who's at URJ, and you have Chrissy Roth at JCPA, and you have Alana Kaufman on the West Coast, who's VP in JCRC. And so we have a lot of, and you have me doing the work that I do across the country. And so you have a lot of visible Jewish leaders of color. And those Jewish leaders of color are bringing with them their lived experience, which is causing the organizations and environments that they're navigating to have to think differently about what Jewish space needs to incorporate.
And this is progress over what, the last decade? 2 decades?
I'd say that's progress over the last 20 years.
20 years, okay. Now, looking outwards, outside of the Jewish community, how is the Jewish community doing at large, doing at engaging with racial justice in broader American society?
Well, before we jump too quickly to the broader American society, the thing I want to say about those leaders is that each of them are probably the only person of color in their entire organizations outside of administrative staff. What that says is that as a Jewish community, we are not in relationship with Jews of color in a representative way that says we are integrated and not additive to a white majority mainstream assumption about what Jewish leadership is.
So how do we get there?
So the way we get there is to think differently about what is the impact of whiteness upon Jewish space.
Right, awesome. Okay, so moving to the second question, on the societal level, to what extent is the Jewish community at the forefront or not of racial justice concerns within American society?
The Jewish community is not at the forefront of racial justice concerns.
That's funny because I think a lot of Jews think Heschel was there in Selma in the 60s and the Jews are at the forefront of all this stuff, and you're saying we're not. So where are we?
Well, I'll tell you where we are. Where we are is still remembering Heschel and forgetting that was almost 80 years ago. And the issue is that if you rely on a relationship from 80 years prior to now and don't go back and trouble what happened with that relationship since then, you're not in real relationship. What you're doing is borrowing Heschel as a model, an emblem of work that we really should have been planting, invigorating, inspiring in real time today. And so I think a lot of what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Movement for Black Lives platform was that we didn't take seriously the impact of lack of relationship. And when things were said and when things actually came out of the current racial justice movement that we didn't like, we couldn't call on those relationships to look for correction in a way that would have been healing and that would have helped us to deepen our partnerships and not fracture them. So what we need to be doing is thinking about what's at stake for us in this moment as a Jewish community. What is the relationship between racism and anti-Semitism? How is it on an everyday that our whiteness impacts our ability to be proximate to what's at stake for most people of color in this country around laws, around education, around immigration? There are all sorts of issues now that are connected to racial justice that we may or may not be connected to if we don't take seriously where we sit in the hierarchy of value that's created around racism.
So if we were to ask some of the leaders of some of the largest and most impactful racial justice organizations in America, is the Jewish community fundamentally an ally? And where is the Jewish community showing up for us and where are they not? What kind of response would we get?
Well, I was on a panel 2 weeks ago with Cornell Brooks from the president, the national president of the NAACP. And it was interesting. I believe the NAACP would say that historically the Jews have been a deep ally to that organization. The first 2 boards of the NAACP were predominantly Jewish. Since then, as the community changed within NAACP leadership and more people of color took the helm. The question is, have we moved beyond just financial support and political posturing in regard to supporting each other's legislation? Have we stayed in proximate community with the Boys and Girls Clubs, with Black churches, with our ability to be out in the street with people who feel like they're being targeted by extrajudicial killings? There are all sorts of different things that are happening in Black community. And the question is, I feel like after we moved out to the suburbs, many of us drove through those communities and we don't stop. And because we drive through Black communities and we don't stop, we're not in relationship in that way. In relationship as funders and as political allies in many cases, and not always as political allies.
This problem of proximity, is this primarily just the suburbanization of the Jewish community? Is it just a physical issue, or has something else happened in the Jewish community over the last few decades that have put us in a less proximate relationship?
Well, when I say relationship, as a consultant, we talk about relationship on 4 levels: personal, interpersonal, cultural, and systemic institutional. And you can be anywhere in the world geographically located, or you can be located around class and still be proximate to the stories that give you information about personal, interpersonal, cultural, and systemic institutional representations of racism. What we do, I think, is we stop in 1 or 2 of those dimensions and we don't take it all the way through. So that in terms of the way we educate about social justice, we're not necessarily knowing who the people are we're servicing, but we're willing to take a service trip. We'll set up a literacy program, but we don't spend time in those communities where people are engaging the need for literacy. We'll support voter enfranchisement, but we don't look at the legislation that is keeping people from getting into the voting booth. So we have to be a little bit more dimensional about our approach.
Okay,
that's what I mean when I say we have to be in a relationship.
So I don't want to idealize the 50s and 60s as if the whole Jewish community was coming out. There certainly were failings there then as well, but it sounds like things have gotten worse. And so what changed within the Jewish community?
The biggest thing I say changed within the Jewish community is the idea of embodiment. I can't get rid of this brown skin, and I'm not even trying. I'm very happy within it. If someone doesn't have on a kippah, or if someone is not openly identifying as Jewish, the most visceral thing people might experience them as is white, unless they're from the Middle East or Africa, or from some place where their phenotype comes up as having brown skin. So in the ways in which we walk through the world and don't have to physically embody a sense of danger, or a sense of feeling like our vitality, our sustainability, our ability to garner resources is actually going to physically be impacted by people, laws, the way in which we navigate the world. A lot of that has shifted between the 60s and now. When you couldn't practice medicine as a white doctor in Johns Hopkins, let's say, and the answer to that was for the Jewish community to create Jewish hospitals. Black communities didn't have the resources or the access to create whole hospitals to service their ability to want to be doctors. They still had to continue to operate within the system. That shift in access to resources and proximity to it being visceral still to your body, whatever the ism is, that is, I think, the thing that separates us. Because as Jews, if we don't choose to be proximate to the issues of anti-Semitism, we don't have to. I don't have a choice about being proximate to the issues of racism if it's a matter of somebody targeting me or racial profiling me or not allowing me into a school because of simply how I look. And in the ways in which we don't think well about what we had, what we've gained, and at what cost, we're not going to remain proximate to these issues.
So you've moved to that personal realm. So in thinking about what's the import of intersectionality now, and in particular as a Jewish woman who is a person of color, how does that play out for you personally as well?
So I actually was just in Baltimore learning with students this past weekend, and I talked to them about intersectionality in the context of the Megillah. And I said that, you know what? I believe you can hold a commitment to racial justice wherever you stand. So if I'm reading the Megillah, I'm reading the Megillah as a woman, looking at Esther as the result of targeted violence, as a result of her standing in a context in which she was essentially raped. Now, if I look at campus communities and the number of women that are actually subject to the vulnerability of being raped on a college campus, I can't read the book of Esther and stay distanced from that as a social justice reality. Similarly, in the context of Mordecai not bowing down to Haman in a public space, that is nothing less than civil disobedience. How am I going to celebrate Mordecai and not look at the fact that it was legislated that all people had to bow down to him, and he stood in public and did not, and not talk about myself as activist? So the way in which I talk about being proximate across intersectionality is that my ear is always to the ground for what is a social justice issue and where does it cross all sections of my identity. Myself as a Jew, myself as a woman, myself as an African American, myself as a committed global citizen. I don't let my social justice fall in the places where I have the access, the resource, and the privilege to possibly forget it. And so intersectionality means all things come with me through the door. And all things that come with me through the door, I'm taking seriously the import of those identities in regard to justice.
Great. So my last question for you, and it was very inspiring with the Megillah, thank you. My last question for you is what are next steps? What are next steps that both our community can be thinking about at large and that individuals listening can be thinking about for their own leadership?
The first thing I'm going to say that I'm telling my community, my beloved community, is that we have to give up fear of being visible in regard to what our history has taught us. I spoke about that example about the Jewish hospital. What's interesting to me about that story is even though there is a Jewish hospital in almost every city, what we haven't done is named within the context of the medical industry the impact of anti-Semitism upon our community. And a major American institution essentially got a pass. So in the ways in which we operate under the radar for the sake of our survival, I think this is a moment where we need to stop doing that. And we have to tell the truth about our history as Jews. And while we tell the truth about our history as Jews, we have to create ways to enter into the fabric of what social justice has required of so many other people in this country. That Jews, yes, are a model minority in some regard in terms of the accomplishments we've made, but at what cost? And we have to start telling the story of those costs. In addition to that, in the ways in which we say social justice is a part of Tikkun Olam, social justice is a part of the fabric of who we are as a spiritual community, we need to see more of that justice work being integrated, not additive, integrated within what we say is Jewish. And the reason why we need to do that is because I meet people all the time who feel very Jewish but have no idea what it has to do with social justice. And for me, the fact that we marched around the desert with an empty box full of nothing but the laws that dictated Bein Adam Lechavero, from our laws man to man, it means that our sense of God is about our behavior, and our sense of God is about how we understand the interactions between ourselves and others. And if the only thing that we can pay attention to is our own survival and what's good for the Jews, what we may be forgetting is what we were put here to do to begin with. And so for me, a next step is to integrate in almost all ways in which we say Jewish, the import and what's at stake for us as Jews, that this world become a better place, and the role we plan to play to make sure that happens.
Beautiful. So, Amen. Powerful stuff. Check out Yavilah McCoy's writings all over the internet, which you can find, and check out Visions, located in Boston, and the diversity work, the racial justice work they're doing nationally and internationally. Thank you so much.
Thank you.